This is the Destiny Well Lab Interpretation Guide for the Men's Hormone Profile Plus. I want to go over something complicated but extremely interesting and important about your hormones. It's called the steroidogenic pathways, and it shows how the major sex steroid hormones as well as your cortisol are closely interrelated and factors that lead from one pathway to the other and how these can influence the levels of the active hormones that you have in your system. We'll talk a little bit about the overview, and then to break it down, we'll go into separate diagrams of how cortisol is produced, what happens with the estrogen hormones, and what happens with the androgens like testosterone. It all starts with cholesterol. If you don't have enough cholesterol, you don't have enough precursors to make your hormones. And so people who take extremely strong cholesterol medicines, they're very sick, or they have very low cholesterol, they may not have enough precursor to make all the molecules they need. And subsequently, their cortisol may be low, or their estrogen and testosterone levels may end up low, affecting their overall well-being. So it starts with cholesterol, and that's converted into pregnenolone. Pregnenolone is the first of the sex-related steroid hormones, and it's a precursor hormone as well. Some of that goes to the hormone progesterone, which is much more common in higher doses in women, and that's important for different phases of the menstrual cycle, but it's also important for brain function and healing in both genders. Next, we'll go into how that turns into cortisol, how it turns into the estrogen hormone group, and how it turns into androgen or male-related testosterone group hormones separately in the next section. Cortisol is a key hormone. It's a life and death hormone. When you're stressed, when you're chased by a lion, when things are desperate in your life, then you make more cortisol. You're in a car accident, you have a heart attack, your body needs to mobilize everything for an emergency. That cranks up your cortisol. So cholesterol goes to pregnenolone and progesterone. Both of those lead to intermediate hormones, 17-hydroxypregnenolone and 17-hydroxyprogesterone. From there, they go to deoxycortisol and then to cortisol itself. Every cell in the body needs cortisol. In an emergency, it's great. It raises your blood sugar, it suppresses your immune system so that you use all of your capacity for flight or fight rather than building things. So it breaks down proteins, it breaks down sugar in storage forms, and it mobilizes you for an emergency, which in an emergency is a great thing. But when you don't have an emergency, when you have a situation where your body's interpreting it as an emergency in our modern culture, you don't get along with your boss, your job is stressful, you have financial difficulties, there's relationship issues or stress where you're living, and your body interprets that as an emergency, then you have sustained high levels of cortisol. Those sustained high levels can break down muscle, they can change the lining of the gut and the integrity of the gut membrane so that you have a leaky gut. They change the health and the character of the microbiome. They make areas of your brain like the hippocampus, which is important for short-term memory incorporation, they make those areas shrink. So an emergency on a long-term basis is not a good thing. But when your body perceives it's in trouble, it shunts as much cholesterol and as many precursors as possible into cortisol. Now, cortisol has one other thing that can happen to it. It can get turned into the inactive cortisone form. Cortisone serves as a reservoir, and so people who have insulin resistance, they have VAT or visceral adipose tissue, fat around the middle, people with diabetes, folks like that are more likely to have high levels of cortisone. The cortisone serves as a reservoir, and so when cortisol goes down, it gets converted back from cortisone to keep it high. So people in that situation may have sustained higher levels of cortisol. So that's the pathway from cholesterol to your emergency hormone cortisol, which is important at moderate levels for function on a day-to-day basis and is used as an emergency situation hormone for things that come up. The first part of this pathway we're going to break down is the estrogen hormone part of the pathway. Again, things start with cholesterol, and they end up at three different estrogens: estrone, estradiol, and estriol. E2, or estradiol, is the strongest of these, the one that's the principal circulating hormone before menopause and is made in the ovaries by women. There's estrone, which is a weaker hormone, and there's estriol, which is also a weaker hormone that comes from estradiol as a less active metabolite. So it starts with cholesterol and goes to pregnenolone and to progesterone, As we said, progesterone is important in both men and women for function of the nervous system. It's helpful for sleep, and it helps with healing of tissues when they're injured. You can go to 17-hydroxypregnenolone or 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Both of those go to the weak androgens DHEA and androstenedione. DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone, is an androgenic molecule. It's one of the most common hormones in circulation. It's made by the adrenal glands, and it's a precursor made into a lot of other things. It peaks in around the 20s, and then as you get older, the levels gradually go down. Now, if you just take exogenous or external DHEA, it will improve your sense of well-being. It'll help muscle mass a little bit. There are receptors in the brain that respond to this. And so a lot of times people say, well, take some DHEA, it'll help you feel better. And it might. But the problem with pouring in a precursor molecule like DHEA is you never know where it's going to go. So you pour in a high dose of this. If you're a man, some of it may get metabolized into the estrogens, like estrone and through testosterone to estradiol. And if you're a woman, it may go into the testosterone pathway. So let's say you're a man, you take some DHEA initially, you get a high dose of that in your system, you get more well-being, you may make some more muscle and feel better. But if you metabolize a lot of it into estrogens, you may get some loss of muscle mass, you may get development of breast tissue, you may get changes in emotional situations and how you feel that you weren't expecting. The opposite is true in women, is if you pour in a bunch of DHEA, you probably will get some increased well-being. You might get a little bit of muscle boost, but additionally you can metabolize that into male hormones. And so if you increase your testosterone or some of the other androgens by doing that, you can get acne, you can get deepening of the voice, you can get other changes or even enlargement of the clitoral area. And so there are a lot of different things that can happen by messing with these precursors. So in general, cholesterol through the progesterone pathways go to the intermediates, and then they're converted to the weak estrogen estrone, and then through testosterone to estradiol. That's where most of it happens in the ovaries. It's directly produced as estradiol and released there. After menopause, estradiol comes from aromatization of some of the adrenal precursors, the DHEA and androstenedione, and so there is less of the estradiol and more of the E1 and E2 hormones following menopause. Now let's take a look at the testosterone or androgen side of the pathway. Again, it begins at cholesterol. Cholesterol has the ring structure that can be made into any of the steroid hormones. It always goes through pregnenolone. Pregnenolone is the initial sex steroid-related metabolite, and that can be turned into progesterone, into the estrogen family, or into the testosterone and androgens. So from pregnenolone, it can go to progesterone. Progesterone also has important functions in men in the neurologic tissues and also for healing. Both pregnenolone and progesterone have 17-hydroxy metabolites, so pregnenolone goes to 17-hydroxypregnenolone and progesterone goes to 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Those can be converted respectively into DHEA and into androstenedione. DHEA can go through intermediates into testosterone, and androstenedione can go directly to testosterone. So both of these pathways ultimately lead to testosterone. We've talked about DHEA as well having important roles. Both DHEA and androstenedione have testosterone-like effects, but they're much weaker, although they do circulate in high levels because they're some of the main hormones made by the adrenal gland, especially DHEA. It's a major precursor molecule. When we give DHEA from the outside, we get increased well-being because there are receptors in the brain that it fits into and helps with overall feeling and how you're doing. It also helps with muscle mass. But like we discussed previously, DHEA can go unpredictably into different pathways. It can end up as estrogens in men, and it can end up as testosterone in women. So the main pathway from cholesterol to testosterone is through the progesterone metabolites, through the weak androgens DHEA and androstenedione, to testosterone itself. Now let's look at these pathways put back together again. It all starts with cholesterol. So if your cholesterol level is too low, you may not be able to make enough cortisol or any of the sex steroid hormones. So we've set the norms at Destiny Well for our optimal zone at a range where you'll have enough cholesterol to make all of these hormone molecules. They go through the progesterones, and then it goes to cortisol when you need it. Now you need a bit of cortisol all the time, but if your body's either chronically stressed, you always perceive it's an emergency, or you really do go through serious emergencies like a car accident or a major surgery, then the body diverts massive amounts of cortisol on a sustained basis into the flight or fight mode. So it'll take all those precursors and shunt things down to cortisol. That's called the cortisol steal. You take everything you have, you put it into life or death reactions. That leaves a lot less molecules to get turned into the estrogens and into testosterone. So your sexual function, your sexual development, your ability to reproduce, all of those go down substantially when it's a life and death situation. So the more we can send our signals for life and death just when there are emergencies rather than all the time from chronic stress, the better and healthier our other hormone pathways will be. If you have a lot of inflammation in your system, then in women, that turns on the 1720 lyase pathway and converts progesterone into androgen metabolites and testosterone. That's what happens in things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, where the 1720 lyase is turned on. That's turned on by things like insulin resistance and abnormal glucose metabolism. And then it's also true that in men, when there's insulin resistance and obesity and visceral adipose around the middle, fat tissue around the belly, that the aromatase enzyme is turned on. That converts testosterone into the most active estrogen, E2 estradiol. And so men then get estrogen type effects when they're stressed from turning on the aromatase. So overall, we can see these pathways are very closely interrelated. How our stress is, how our precursors are, how the balance in our life is, as well as our glucose metabolism and our body habitus. All these play together to determine the balance of hormones we have and our overall state of health. Testosterone is a powerful and controversial hormone. It's the main male hormone responsible for secondary sexual characteristics, such as development of the genitalia, hair growth, muscle mass, and sexual function. The response to different testosterone levels is highly individual. Some people can have very low testosterone levels and have no symptoms at all, be totally fine in terms of sexual function, and their muscle mass even seems normal. Other people can be high and be in a similar situation where they have no symptoms at all and seem to be totally fine. On the other hand, as a group, when people's testosterone gets below 300 to 400, they often will lose energy, they'll become more emotional, they lose muscle mass, and their sexual function may decline. When men's testosterone gets too high, they may become more aggressive, and they also get side effects such as increased production of red blood cells. This leads to thickening in the blood in a condition called polycythemia that sets you up for increased risk of stroke and heart attack and other conditions when blood doesn't flow appropriately. At Destiny Well, we believe the optimal testosterone range is probably in the 500 to 700 area, and that values over 1,000 are too high, with 700 to 1,000 probably okay for many people, but possibly a little on the high side. In evolutionary times, when people exercised more, had more muscle mass, and ate a higher meat diet and lived more outdoors, it's possible that many men had a higher testosterone level of 700 to 1,000 or even over 1,000. But in today's society, 500 to 700 is a reasonable target because most people feel fine and function fine at that level. 400 to 500 we consider moderately low, and less than 400 is too low. There are a number of diet and lifestyle things you can do that will change your testosterone or boost it without taking external hormones. This graph shows that testosterone varies over time. It tends to peak around age 20, it's going up rapidly in adolescence, and then it gradually drifts down over the years to much lower levels. So peak levels in the 20s are maybe twice as high as they are for people who are 80 or 90. There are natural ways to raise testosterone without taking testosterone hormone. Weight training is a very good one. The more you build muscle mass, the higher it raises your testosterone. HIIT training, or high-intensity interval training, is also good. As opposed to long-range running or jogging, HIIT training is exercising to maximum tolerance for 30 to 60 seconds, resting for 30 to 60 seconds, and then repeating the cycle 7 to 10 times. Avoiding sugar and alcohol helps raise testosterone, as does decreasing stress. As we showed in the steroidogenesis pathways, the more stress you're under, the more the body thinks it's an emergency to make more cortisol. Cortisol is our survival stress hormone. But if you think you're under stress all the time and you keep sending the signals to make more and more cortisol, you have less precursors to turn into testosterone, so your testosterone level is low. And decreasing that stress decreases the signal to build cortisol and leaves more to build testosterone and other hormones. Garlic and avocado can help increase testosterone levels, as can cold showers or swimming in cold water. James Bond apparently did this as a tradition. Also, having sex or sexual activity increases your testosterone as well. There's another important factor in understanding men's hormones. That's called SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin. This tends to start out moderately low, and then as you age, it builds up higher. Now, why is this important? Well, SHBG binds testosterone tightly. And when it's bound to SHBG, it's not available for use in the cells. So having a high SHBG effectively lowers the available testosterone to your body. At Destiny Well, our reference lab range is 15 nanomoles per liter to 50 nanomoles per liter. Ranges between 20 and 50 are considered normal, and in general, it gets higher as you age, which decreases your free available testosterone. The ratio of total testosterone to SHBG gives an indicator of how much free testosterone you have available to get into the cells. If the ratio is high, it means there's lots of testosterone and not so much SHBG. That means that more of the testosterone is free and unbound and available to get into the cells and exert testosterone-like effects. If, on the other hand, the SHBG is high or the testosterone is low, then that ratio goes down, and that means more of it's bound to SHBG and less available for use. Our reference laboratory ranges are 0.7 to 1.0. This value often goes down with age, but not always, and so in general, higher free testosterone is better. Surprisingly, estradiol is an important hormone for male health and male well-being. Estradiol is the main E2 female hormone, but it also has important roles in men. Estradiol is important for bone density as well as for other types of metabolism. Estradiol, when it gets too high, can lead to the development of breast tissue in men, change fat distribution, change emotions, and other things. And that happens more when someone has increased visceral adipose fat tissue around the middle and when they have insulin resistance. That turns on the aromatase enzyme that converts testosterone into estradiol. On the low end, low estradiol is actually associated with increased morbidity and mortality, which means you have more medical complications and you die sooner. So you need enough estradiol around for your cells to function. At Destiny Well, we define optimal estradiol levels for men at 22 to 30, mildly low at 13 to 21, and low at less than 12 picograms per milliliter. On the high side, 31 to 56 is mildly elevated, and greater than 56 is too high for estradiol. Low estradiol can lead to problems like fatigue and sleepiness, hypersomnia where you sleep too much, changes in sexual function, and it's especially important for bone density. Men need estrogen to form bone. So osteoporosis, which is thinning of the bones, and osteopenia, which is a mild stage of bone thinning, can both happen when you have too low estradiol. High estradiol can lead to decreased erectile function and the inability to maintain an erection, can lead to water retention, as well as hot flashes and insomnia. It can lead to changes in emotion and brain fog. It can also decrease the size of your testicles. DHEA is a hormone produced by the adrenals. It's a hormone precursor that can turn into many other hormones, including estrogen and progesterone. It has mild male androgenic type hormone effects on its own, and since it's one of the most prominent and common hormones in circulation, even mild androgenic effects or mild male hormone stimulating effects can be evident when you have large amounts of it. It's related to muscle mass and vitality, and it can turn into both estrogen and progesterone. We measure DHEAS in saliva, or dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate, because the sulfate form is more stable and gives better reliable readings in salivary tests. DHEA tends to peak around age 20 and then gradually goes down after age 20 as you age. DHEA and the sulfate form DHEAS that's more readily measured in saliva are important hormones because it's a precursor hormone and it's one of the most common hormones produced by the adrenal gland. Like in men, DHEA tends to peak in the 20s and then go down significantly with age until it's only a fraction of the previous peak levels. DHEA has a male androgenic type component and helps muscle mass, but it can also be converted into testosterone or into estrogen or other hormones. So it's important to be careful with giving DHEA supplements because you don't know exactly what they're going to turn into, and they could elevate levels of testosterone in women and cause things like voice changes, enlargement of the clitoral area, and acne, as well as irregular cycles and other problems. Cortisol is the body's main stress hormone. The reference lab range for cortisol is 8.5 micrograms per deciliter to 19.8 micrograms per deciliter. Cortisol has a strong diurnal pattern. It tends to peak in the morning, and if it doesn't get up to normal morning levels, we worry that you're cortisol deficient, or you could even have a disease like Addison's disease, where your body makes inadequate amounts of cortisol. Destiny Well has set the optimal range at 10 to 15, mildly high at 15 to 19.8, and too high over 19.8, with mildly low at 8.6 to 9.9, and too low at less than 8.5. Since cortisol is so critical for life on a day-to-day basis, it tends not to go down as we age, but it does have a strong day cycle rhythm. Over the course of 24 hours, if you're on a normal sleep cycle, sleeping at night, waking up in the morning, it bottoms out around 3 a.m. and then rapidly peaks somewhere just around or before 8 a.m. Then it goes down as the day goes on to be lower in the afternoon, getting you ready for sleep, and higher in the morning, activating things and raising your blood sugar, getting you ready for the day. A Canadian physiologist by the name of Hans Selye described many years ago what he called the general adaptation response. It's the stages that the HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that regulates the cortisol and DHEA production from the adrenal glands, go through in their adaptation to chronic response. We mostly tell what stage people are in by measuring the cortisols at different times of day and also by checking their DHEA level. In the normal stress response, the person is calm, healthy, and energetic. Their baseline cortisol goes up in the morning to get the body ready and to raise the blood sugar and to get ready for the day. It then goes down a good bit by noon and continues to fall in the afternoon and then bottoms in the middle of the night, only to start that cycle over again in the morning with peak cortisols to get you ready for the next day. The DHEA levels would be expected to be normal then. In the early phase of the chronic HPA stress response, we see that the total cortisol output is high, and one or more readings are actually high. The DHEA can be normal, or it can be low. It will typically show that the cortisol levels on several readings are higher than the expected range. When we move into the mid stage of chronic HPA axis stress response, we see a different pattern. Total cortisol is normal. Cortisol is low in the morning and noon or afternoon, and then it goes up either in the late afternoon or evening. So it's sort of a reverse pattern. These people often have a lot of trouble sleeping, and their DHEA is frequently low. Then in the final late stage of chronic HPA stress response, the exhaustion phase, we see that the total cortisol is low all day long, and the DHEA is low. This may be lower than the normal range throughout the entire day. Now, when people have lab-high cortisols, we worry that they could have Cushing's disease, and they may actually need further tests to make sure that they don't have a syndrome where the body's producing too much cortisol, and in that case, they might have things like abnormal accumulation of fat around the shoulders, development of red moon phase, development of high blood pressure and diabetes. And even more acutely life-threatening is people who have truly low cortisols. They may have what's called Addison's disease. And if you have Addison's, you can't put out enough cortisol in response to stress. So if you get in a car accident or have pneumonia or a heart attack, you may not be able to put out enough cortisol and you could die suddenly. So when the values are lab high or lab low for cortisol, the first thing to do is to make sure someone doesn't have either Addison's disease if it's low or Cushing's disease if it's high. And then if those are ruled out, then we worry about what's their chronic stress adaptation response and how can we help modulate that. So symptoms of too much cortisol when you get Cushing's disease are red, round, flushed face, elevated blood pressure, thinning of the bones and osteoporosis, elevated blood sugars or diabetes, purple stretch marks or stria on the skin look the same that many women get with pregnancy, mood swings and anxiety, rapid weight gain in the face, chest, abdomen, and with thin arms and legs, and often with a buildup of fat in the upper central shoulders. These people will often have increased thirst and frequent urination. Symptoms of too little cortisol, Addison's disease, include fatigue, dizziness, especially dizziness on standing, a lot of nausea, weight loss, muscle weakness, mood changes, and then darkening of the skin. They may get an actual bronze type color that's even different than you get with an intense suntan. There's a hierarchy of hormones, with adrenal hormones like cortisol ahead of thyroid hormones, ahead of sex steroid hormones like estrogen and progesterone in women and testosterone in men. If someone has a severe adrenal problem like Addison's disease where they don't produce adequate amounts of cortisol, then it may be a life-threatening condition. The salts in their blood like sodium and potassium can be way out of balance, but it also affects the production and function of other hormones, so their thyroid hormone may be low as well. And just addressing the adrenal problem by fixing the cortisol can actually normalize the thyroid without any separate treatment for the thyroid. Similarly, if someone, say a woman, has a thyroid problem and her thyroid function is low, she has hypothyroidism, then her periods may be irregular, she might have problems like infertility, in addition to the typical symptoms of low thyroid. So fixing the thyroid for her might normalize her sex steroids, might normalize her estrogen and her progesterone, get her cycles back to normal, and even fix infertility. We measure at Destiny Well the free hormones, the free T3 and the free T4. There are total amounts of those you can measure in the blood called total T4 and total T3. Those are somewhat less relevant because a lot of it is tightly bound to proteins and they're not available for the cells. The free T4 is critical in the feedback loop in terms of what the brain sees and the signals it sends to the thyroid to make more or less thyroid hormone. And the free T3 is probably the most critical. It's the active form of thyroid hormone that the cells see that tells them to regulate their metabolism and many other important functions. There's also another hormone that's rarely measured called the RT3 or the reverse T3. If you've been to a doctor and you haven't gotten the explanation you need, or all your thyroid tests look normal, but you still have symptoms of hypothyroidism, you're cold, you're sluggish, you're tired, you have a lot of fatigue, many other symptoms like that, then measuring the RT3 can see if this inactive form or blocking form of the T3 hormone is actually interfering with your thyroid function at the cellular level. I've trained many doctors and many medical students over the years, and thyroid hormones are tricky to understand, but there are a lot of things we can do about them on a practical level. Lifestyle things, lifestyle changes, things that can affect the T3 to RT3 ratio, that's how active your hormones are, nutritional things that will affect this metabolism. And so especially if you're not feeling better after the usual interventions or after just normalizing your thyroid hormones, it may be time to check the RT3. Most thyroid hormone released from the thyroid gland is the T4. Some of that gets bound to protein, and then some of it is free circulating around in the system. In the cells, especially the liver, the majority of T4 is converted into T3. If the gut microbiome, the bacteria in the gut, are healthy, about 20% of the thyroid hormone is converted from the T4 to the active T3 there. Then it's reabsorbed back into the circulation and goes to the cells. We also mentioned that adrenal function is critical. The thyroid needs normal adrenal function, normal cortisol levels in order to produce adequate thyroid hormone and for it to work at the cellular level. This is one of my favorite diagrams. It shows the feedback loop and how the brain and the thyroid work together and how they talk to each other. a brain area called the hypothalamus puts out a hormone called TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. That goes down to the anterior pituitary, which is also in the brain. The pituitary gland is where the TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, is made. Thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it says. It stimulates the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. Most of what it puts out is T4, but about 7% of its output is active T3 hormone. Then, when the T3, T4 hormone increases, it gets into balance, and things like low body temperature go back up to normal, heart rate, blood pressure, bowel function, many things that were out of balance normalize when the T3 and the T4 concentrations are normal. When the brain sees adequate or increased amounts of T3 and T4, then it stops sending out extra signal of TSH, and the TSH level goes down. So when everything's working normally, that's how the thyroid and the brain talk to each other and how they regulate each other. This is where it gets tricky. Most doctors and most patients assume that all thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland. When a thyroid problem, either too high or too low, either hyper or hypothyroidism, happens in the level of the thyroid gland, it's called primary hyperthyroidism for too high and primary hypothyroidism for too low. That's the way most doctors look at thyroid tests and interpret them. What that fails to recognize is that sometimes the problem is in the brain, and that's called secondary or tertiary. If it's at the level of the pituitary in the brain, it's secondary, and if it's at the level of the hypothalamus or higher, it's called tertiary. The reason that's important is that they have somewhat opposite and differing effects on what the tests look like, and they may look like hyperthyroidism when it's actually hypo, or hypo when it's actually hyper, if you're just looking at the TSH and you don't check the other hormones. Primary thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland itself. Primary hypothyroidism is one of the most common conditions we encounter in medical practice. Hypothyroidism usually comes from something called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, after the doctor who discovered that antibodies were attacking the thyroid in an autoimmune fashion and destroying its ability to secrete thyroid hormone. This is the main kind of primary hypothyroidism we see, but nutritional deficiencies and other problems can also cause this. Hyperthyroidism can also be autoimmune, that's called Graves' disease, or you can have a thyroid nodule that doesn't respond to the feedback loops and just keeps putting out more and more thyroid hormone on its own and doesn't recognize or respond to the signals from the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Both of those conditions, primary hyper and primary hypothyroidism, are in the expected direction that we see for thyroid tests because what we're looking for most of the time is we're looking for the responses we would see as if the condition were primary. But in the back of our mind, we always have to keep in mind that it could be secondary or tertiary. If the problem is in the brain, then the problem is whether the pituitary and the hypothalamus signaling the pituitary send the right signal. If it's secondary, that's a pituitary problem, and if it's tertiary, it's the hypothalamus that sends the signals to the pituitary. So for instance, if the brain just puts out too much TSH, say you have an adenoma or a benign tumor of the brain, and it sends out too much TSH signal, it just keeps sending that signal because the tumor's secreting that, then the thyroid will respond and produce more thyroid hormone. The same thing is true if there's damage to the pituitary. Sometimes after childbirth, people get a condition where they have a hemorrhage into that area, or they have bleeding into the brain that destroys that, or people who've had brain tumors or radiation or damage to the brain, they may lose the ability to secrete TSH. Then they have a secondary tertiary problem in terms of not producing the TSH, and if the signal is not sent to the thyroid, then the thyroid doesn't know to make thyroid hormone. Most of what we're going to talk about and most of what we look for are primary thyroid conditions happening at the level of the thyroid gland. And the vast majority of what we see is hypothyroidism, and the majority of that is Hashimoto's. But there are variations on that, so we want to be aware of all the different things that can happen. TSH is the most commonly measured thyroid hormone. As we discussed, many doctors don't measure anything other than TSH. But for me, that's like looking at a jigsaw puzzle with only one piece. If the puzzle has 5 or 6 or 7 pieces, you get a lot more complete picture of what's actually going on if you put them all together than if you just look at a single piece. TSH has a reference lab range of 0.4 on the low and 4.0 on the high. At Destiny Well, we think the optimal level of TSH is 1.8 to 3.0, with values over 3 representing thyroid function in primary hypothyroidism that is too low. 90 to 95% of the population have a TSH under 3, and so we think it makes sense to be in the range below that. We think a value of under 0.4 is too low, and between 0.5 and 1.7 may also be on the low side. So here's why thyroid functions are so tricky for most people. It's not intuitive, but it is true that an elevated TSH means low thyroid function in primary hypothyroidism at the level of the thyroid gland. TSH is the signal from the brain to the thyroid gland to make more thyroid hormones. In the most common condition, the primary hypothyroidism that occurs from Hashimoto's thyroiditis, where the gland is attacked by autoimmune disease, or other conditions at the level of the thyroid gland, where the thyroid is not making adequate hormone, then the brain says, I'm not receiving enough thyroid hormone, I should put out the stimulating hormone, the TSH, to tell the thyroid gland to make more. So while intuitively we think, oh, TSH is the main thyroid test, if it's high, that must mean my thyroid function's high, the opposite is true. It means the signal to make more thyroid hormone is high, and that happens in the setting of hypothyroidism or low thyroid function. So just remember, high TSH means low thyroid function, means hypothyroidism most of the time, because most thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland, and that's the way the brain responds, and we're measuring the brain response with the TSH. The brain is mostly responsive to free T4, which is somewhat surprising since free T3 is the active hormone throughout the rest of the body. And it's an area that can get us into trouble some because we think, oh, we have an adequate T4, everything else must be good. But that's not necessarily true because there are a number of factors, both nutritional and stress and other hormones that have to be in balance for adequate conversion of T4 into T3 and also to keep T4 from being converted into RT3, the blocking hormone. So normally when the T4 goes up, the TSH goes down, and when the T4 goes down, that's the main hormone put out by the thyroid gland, the brain senses there's not enough T4, puts out TSH to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more hormones. So the pattern we see in primary hypothyroidism is TSH elevated, free T4 decreased, and free T3 is also decreased. You should know, however, what we just talked about, that sometimes if the problem is at the level of the brain, in the pituitary, or the hypothalamus, then hypothyroidism has an almost opposite pattern. You get a decreased TSH leading to decreased T4 and T3. So instead of the brain responding, telling you to make more by putting out more TSH, it's the brain that has the problem. It doesn't put out enough TSH, and so the thyroid gland doesn't respond. So the T3 and the T4 and the free T3 and the free T4 are all low in that circumstance. This table is a good summary. It shows that in primary hypothyroidism, the thyroid gland fails to produce the hormones, and then the brain responds by upping the TSH signal. So the TSH is up, the brain is saying send more, and the free T4 and the free T3 that we measure are down because the thyroid gland is not able or willing to do that. In secondary hypothyroidism, the brain fails to send the signal to produce thyroid hormone. So the TSH is low, and the thyroid thinks everything is fine, so it has no stimulus to produce the T3 and the T4, so the free T3 and the free T4 are decreased. When we have elevated thyroid function, or hyperthyroidism, if it's primary, happening at the level of the thyroid gland, then the thyroid overproduces hormones on an independent basis. It doesn't wait for the signal from the brain. It just produces elevated amounts of free T4 and free T3. And in that case, the brain responds by decreasing the TSH. It says, we have enough, we don't need to send any more. Secondary hyperthyroidism at the level of the brain is when the brain sends too much TSH signal to produce the hormone. It sends out excessive TSH. It doesn't respond to the feedback when the levels are adequate. It just keeps sending out TSH, and the thyroid keeps producing free T3 and free T4, so all three are up. Hashimoto's and Graves' disease are both autoimmune thyroid disorders. Interestingly, autoimmunity can cause low thyroid function in Hashimoto's, where the thyroid is attacked by the autoimmune process and destroyed, thus losing its ability to make adequate thyroid hormone and leading to low thyroid function or hypothyroidism. In Graves' disease, the thyroid becomes overactive from the autoimmune process and continues to release too much thyroid hormone, leading to overactivity, which even can be life-threatening. Some families have members that have both Hashimoto's and Graves' disease, and some people in their lifetime have both Hashimoto's and Graves'. Fixing the hormones without addressing the underlying cause of autoimmunity is less effective, and many people still do not feel well, because even if you replace the hormones to perfect ranges, you can still feel terrible if you have an ongoing autoimmune attack against your tissues. And autoimmune diseases also tend to run together, so you're at risk of having more than one autoimmune disease. The most commonly used marker of autoimmune thyroid function is called TPO, thyroid peroxidase antibodies, or sometimes it's also called microsomal antibodies. Obviously, the desirable amount of thyroid attacking antibodies to TPO is 0. You don't want your body attacking your thyroid gland at all. We say that the level of 1 to 34 is mildly elevated, and greater than 34 units per milliliter is elevated or abnormal TPO antibodies. There are many factors that affect both the production, the conversion, and the activity of thyroid hormones. As we mentioned, the main thing that the thyroid secretes is T4. The free T4 hormone circulates in the bloodstream, and some of it is converted to T3, mostly by the liver, but also by the gut. Now, T3 is the active hormone. So in terms of the production, the body needs adequate amounts of iron and iodine. Thyroid molecules are very iodine rich. Each of them has several molecules of iodine attached to it. It needs the amino acid tyrosine. It needs adequate amounts of zinc, selenium, vitamin E, B2, B3, B6, C, and D. If you have too much stress, if you have infection, trauma, or radiation, if you have fluoride or bromine in your system, those can antagonize the iodine and replace it in the molecules, making them less effective or less active. And then many toxins like pesticides, mercury, cadmium, and lead can all affect the ability of the thyroid to produce hormones, as well as autoimmune diseases. And celiac is very commonly associated with Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. So I recommend that everyone with hypothyroidism get tested for celiac. Now, once the T4 has been produced, it's not all over. The brain mostly sees T4, but many cells in the body need the active T3 hormone to regulate their metabolism and their function. So we need to convert T4 into T3. And it can either be converted into T3, or as we discussed, in situations where there's too much stress or trauma or very serious illness, or other kinds of things like a low-calorie diet, or overall inflammation, certain toxins, infections, liver or kidney dysfunctions, and some medicines, then T3 is decreased in production and RT3 goes up. And RT3 is not only an inactive form of thyroid hormone, it blocks T3. So the ratio of T3 to RT3 is important. Now, when the thyroid gets into the cell, it's still not complete. So it needed selenium and zinc to be converted. And then once it's in the cell to be active and effective, it needs vitamin A and zinc. And exercise is also important because it produces factors that help the thyroid function be affected in the cells. Active thyroid hormone and increases in circulating levels of thyroid increase metabolism. The main risks of overtreatment with thyroid medicines over time are osteoporosis and atrial fibrillation. Osteoporosis is thinning of the bones that leads to fracture risk, and atrial fibrillation is an erratic heart rhythm problem that starts in the top part of the heart and is an irregular rhythm that has other risks associated with it, such as stroke. Thyroid hormone treatment has also been used outside of specifically treatment for thyroid as adjunctive treatment or augmentation for depression therapy. It's combined with antidepressant medicine sometimes to help with symptoms of depression. When someone has low thyroid function, replacement helps many different conditions. It lowers triglycerides, it makes the body form LDL cholesterol receptors and helps change LDL particle number. It helps things like muscle aches and weakness, including fibromyalgia. It's also important to optimize vitamin D whenever you have muscle aches or weakness. It can improve mood and it can improve bowel function, among other things. Our free T4 ranges, the lab reference range is 0.93 nanograms per deciliter on the low side to 1.0 nanograms per deciliter on the high side. We think 1 to 1.5, the green zone, is optimal, and we think less than 0.93, the lab normal, low, is too low. We also believe 0.93 to 0.99 is moderately low, 1.6 to 1.7 is moderately high, and again agreeing with the lab reference range, greater than 1.7 is too high. The free T3 is the active hormone. We find it to be critical, and it's what acts inside the cells. Most of the time, free T3 is a good representation of what your thyroid is doing. Occasionally, T3 will be elevated in hyperthyroidism without elevation of T4, so I always check both. Rarely, T3 won't be able to get into the cells, and you'll have what's called T3 pooling. So it looks like there's a lot of T3, but it's actually not making it into the cells where it can affect its action. For T3, the lab reference range is 2.1 picograms per milliliter to 4.3 picograms per milliliter. We feel that the optimal zone is 3.4 to 4.3, with being higher than 4.3 is too high and lower than 2.1 is too low, with 2.1 to 3.3 in a mildly low range. So what happens when you have too little thyroid hormone, when you have hypothyroidism or an underactive thyroid? Well, you get weight gain, and lots of people would love to have something specific to fix, and so we do check it in anybody who has unexplained weight gain. People often feel cold because thyroid is needed for cellular metabolism and thermogenesis. So to make heat in your body, you need metabolism, and for metabolism, every cell needs thyroid hormone. Bowel function typically slows down. People get constipated. They have foggy thinking. Their heart rate may slow. Their body temperature is low. Women will have irregular menstrual periods or even stop having cycles. That's associated with infertility. Thinning hair is common, and then cholesterol and triglycerides go up. People will also have low mood and low motivation. What about symptoms of too much or overactive thyroid, hyperthyroidism? Well, the opposite happens. You get rapid or irregular heart rates, including atrial fibrillation. Patients get unexplained weight loss. They feel hot all the time. They may have shaking or tremor. They have diarrhea or increased bowel movements. They notice increased sweating, insomnia, and anxiety. Tests included in the Destiny Well Men's Hormone Profile Plus include testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG, calculated free testosterone index, estradiol, DHEA sulfate, cortisol, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, free T4 thyroid hormone, free T3 thyroid hormone, and TPA antibodies against thyroid peroxidase. At Destiny Well, we've been extremely fortunate to find some amazingly good coaches, people with backgrounds of success in varied fields who bring all sorts of resources and talent and skill to help you. These folks have many years of clinical experience, and they know how to be of assistance at every step of the way, from motivation to connecting you with the right resources to finding things that you need to get you on your journey. To learn more, go to destinywell.com/coaching to meet our team and find out how they can be of service to you.